What a pathetic bunch of people. Why don't you go and live in Gaza? What about the genocide of South Africans being murdered in South Africa? Hi, my name is Nathan Geffen. I'm the editor of GroundUp News. We've been covering protests about what's happening in Gaza that have been taking place in South Africa, like this protest in Sea Point, this march to Parliament, this pro-Israel protest that was disrupted, and these journalists protesting over their murdered colleagues. These videos have accumulated thousands of, let's say, level-headed comments. Let's respond to some of them. KP Hippo asks, how does this help? And in brackets he says, or she says, I'm not against it. People protest in order to raise awareness about an atrocity or human rights violation that's happening. It doesn't necessarily result in that atrocity coming to an end. But hopefully, if there's enough protests, if there's enough public outcry about human rights violations and about what's happening in Gaza, that in future we'll develop systems around the world, better protections around the world that reduce the risk of civilians being murdered by armies and similar horrors taking place. User Dharma says, so now those poor kids at the Red Cross hospital that are trying to recover have to put up with that noise and disturbance outside. User Dharma, I've driven past Red Cross Hospital many times, and I'm pretty sure that the noise from the cars far exceeds the noise from the protests. I'm pretty sure the kids will be okay. Sharon Levy 5201 says, what a pathetic bunch of people, puppets with banners. They don't even know what is going on. They are uneducated in the subject. Ho to Gaza. Well, Sharon Levy, I think that's quite presumptuous. I'm pretty sure a lot of the people that are going to these protests have read up quite a lot about what's going on in Gaza, and they're outraged by seeing innocent people being killed by bombs, by the actions of soldiers. And I think this is a pretty poor way to respond to people who are trying to show solidarity with the rights of people around the world. Teacup Yorkie 84 says, what about Ukraine, Sudan, Madagascar and Yemen? Nah, f*** their famine and their dying and starvation. As long as you free Palestine, double standards at its best. Because there are terrible things happening in one part of the world doesn't mean that people shouldn't protest about terrible things happening in another part of the world. We're all human, we've got limited bandwidth, there's a limit to what we can do with our lives and what we can express concern about. And if people are animated by what's going on in Gaza, then I think they're fully entitled to express their concern. That doesn't mean that these other horrible things that you've raised that are happening in other countries shouldn't be addressed too, but there's only a limit to how much any individual person can take on. H. Vanameva says, why don't you go and live in Gaza? If you're supporting the terrorist regime in Gaza, aren't you terrorists yourself? Well, H. Vanameva, many of the people protesting do not support Hamas and do not support terrorism, and they don't support killing of civilians on any side. They're expressing their outrage at the fact that Israel is killing tens of thousands of people who are not combatants and who are civilians. As for going to live in Gaza, well, no, I don't think myself or any of the protesters would want to go and live in Gaza right now because the probability of being killed by Israeli bombs is extremely high. Hempel 7902 says, why did Hamas start it? They kidnapped innocent teenagers and older civilians and children. If they had never done this, nothing would have happened. Free the hostages. Killing of civilians, especially children, is unacceptable on both sides. Stop this fighting. Free the hostages. It's been nearly 2 years. So Hempel 7902, this conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians has a history that goes back well over 100 years. It didn't start on 7 October 2023. But let's be clear, what Hamas did on 7 October was appalling when they invaded Israel and killed about 1,000 civilians. But it was certainly not the first massacre in this long conflict. In 1982, for example, in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon, Lebanese militia, with the aid of the Israeli Defense Forces, killed over 1,000 Palestinians. That doesn't justify in any way what happened on 7 October, just as what happened on 7 October doesn't justify in any way the murder of tens of thousands of civilians that's taken place since then by the Israeli Defense Forces. Hempel, you make a good point about the hostages, but the families of the hostages themselves have criticized the Israeli government for not doing enough to negotiate a ceasefire with Hamas, which would make it easier to get the hostages back. Sweet Mike 89 says, what about the genocide of South Africans being murdered in South Africa? Plus 26,000 every year. Total killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023 equals plus 60,000 over 2 years equals 30,000 per year. South Africa is literally a war zone. This excludes the 53,000 rapes and 7,500 attempted murders annually. Sweet Mike 89, I'm afraid your mathematics is off. South Africa's population is about 30 times bigger than the population of Gaza. So if you're going to be comparing the number of murders in South Africa to the number of murders in Gaza, you have to multiply the number of murders that have taken place in Gaza over the last 2 years by 30. There's no doubt that there are far too many murders taking place in South Africa, but there isn't a genocide taking place here. The 60,000 people that have been killed in Gaza over less than 2 years so far is a substantial underestimate of the actual number of people that have died in the violence that is primarily being committed by the Israeli Defense Forces. Meme Duck says, what's this got to do with us? Well, Meme Duck, we live in one world, and increasingly there's a view that we need to express solidarity with people across the world when human rights are abused. Under apartheid, people across the world fought for the rights of black South Africans to have the same rights as white South Africans. And for people now to express concern about what's happening in Gaza is, I think, entirely reasonable, given that the world has become a globalized place. Linda Tyra writes, he was not a journalist, he was a Hamas terrorist using Al Jazeera as a cover. I presume Linda is talking about Anas al-Sharif. I have no idea who Anas al-Sharif was, what his political affiliations were, nor for that matter for the nearly 200 journalists who've been killed in Gaza over the last nearly 2 years. But there's no doubt that Israel has been targeting journalists, and there's no doubt that the vast majority of them were unarmed and not taking part in any combat at the time that they were killed. And it's extremely unlikely that most of them, or even a large number of them, were secretly doing the work of Hamas. Okay, Dion now has a long thesis. Dion now asks, so here is my question. Has anyone asked how many Israeli journalists have died? Well, in fact, yes, about 6 Israeli journalists have died in the conflict, most of them on 7 October 2023. But this isn't a competition to see whether more Israeli journalists or more Palestinian journalists have died. It's unacceptable when any journalists are killed covering a conflict, and we need journalists to be able to cover conflicts like this, whether it be in Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan or anywhere where people are fighting, because otherwise the rest of us don't know what's going on.